Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm happy to have you. Today we're going to be talking about The Lady of Shalott by Alfred Tennyson, and I am going to be touching on both publications. His first one in about 1833 and then the second publication in 1842. So I have already annotated my text. You'll notice that there is a lot. I have my first read, my second read, my outside sources, and then these blue sticky notes indicate the lines that are different between the 1833 and 42 versions. So if you are choosing which text to do for your summer reading, I would greatly encourage you to choose the 1842 version, as it was the edited version that he wanted to present. The first version of the poem was his first solo publication. It was not well received. It was heavily criticized, so he didn't publish again for 9 years. He took that to heart, and he edited the poem and created a kind of a different message throughout the edits that he made, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But if you were not aware of the two versions, I would recommend going with the 1842 for your summer reading. Now, this poem is a Victorian poem, and some would say it's a Victorian criticism, but it has a lot of the different characteristics that we focused on with Romanticism, being that it has a really pleasant view of nature and a focus on nature having meaning, whereas in the Victorian era, people didn't really want to believe that nature was amazing so much as threatening and something that needed to be avoided, because it was in itself meaningless. It was just the brutal existence of nature. So if you were watching an animal eat another animal because it needs to survive, that is a brutal, ruthlessness that is specific to nature, and it's like nature was its own surviving mechanism that didn't have any inward meaning or anything like that. There are some differences there. This is a narrative poem, so it's a poem that tells a story. It's kind of a magical fairy tale type of story set in a medieval period. We know that because we have Camelot, and that brings up all of these allusions to Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, Lancelot and his tryst with Guinevere, and how his involvement with the Queen destroyed all of Camelot. So you have those things that kind of come to mind as you're reading the poem already. It is a ballad form, is like a song or a love song, a love poem. It's meant to be sung or read in a sing-song voice, so kind of like nursery rhymes, and that was done in a way to make the poem entertaining if it was presented aloud, but also to make it easy to remember. Back in the historical times when ballads were written, the people who would come and present these songs would do so as a means of their career and a means of getting employment and getting paid, so it was easy for them to remember something that was turned into a song. Characteristics that you'll note with the ballad: a simple repeated rhyme, a refrain, verses that are the same length, 9 lines each, and it has a set rhyme scheme. So those are things about the ballad. In the text, there is tons of imagery, so much specific detail focusing on the setting and how beautiful the setting is, and there's a running comparison between Camelot and Shalott, which is where the Lady of Shalott lives, and she lives very near to Camelot, but she's not able to interact with Camelot at all. We find out that there is a curse on her that keeps her living in her tower. She cannot interact with the world around her, but she can view it from a mirror that hangs in front of her and allows her to see out of a window. So she has this detachment and isolation from the real world, and it seems as though she's happy. As you're reading through the poem, she sings, she has a happy song, she delights in her weaving, and the different images that she weaves are images that she sees in her mirror of the goings-on of Camelot. So it's kind of her way of interacting, it's her way of participating in the world around her by just capturing these images of what she sees, wishing that she were part of it. And you start to get the idea that she is unhappy, because there are times when she's viewing what's going on around her. Specifically, the first line comes up with the knights. The knights come riding 2 by 2. She hath no loyal knight and true, the Lady of Shalott. So you're thinking, okay, maybe she's lonely for companionship, maybe she's lonely for love. But then you see in the next stanza, or when the moon was overhead, came 2 young lovers lately wed. I'm half sick of shadows, said the Lady of Shalott. seeing that she's half sick of shadows. She's kind of getting sick of her half life, this bland life where she does not really have a lot going on for herself. She has to weave all day, every day, all night, or if she stops weaving, some curse will befall her, and she doesn't know the details of the curse. We, the reader, don't know who put the curse on her or why she was cursed, much like any kind of Disney princess who is cursed. We don't know a lot about it. We do know that it affects her ability to live a real life, or a true life, a genuine life. And so she's going about her life in its limited form as it is, until one day in part 3, Lancelot in all of his glory. If you're not familiar with the character Lancelot, he is said to be incredibly handsome. So handsome, in fact, that he could have any woman that he wanted, which is why the issue of him falling in love with Guinevere was really problematic, because King Arthur was his best friend. Guinevere was the queen and Arthur's wife, and she was the ultimate beauty, but the ultimate beauty that he could not have. So he wanted women that he couldn't have, and that he could get any woman he wanted, including that difficult get. So he's beautiful, he's a brave knight, he is an honest and loyal knight until he wasn't, until he betrays his friend. So he was kind of this pinnacle of masculinity and of desire. And we see the Lady of Shalott as she hears him singing and sees him come across her mirror. She stops what she's doing. She left the web, she left the loom. She made 3 paces through the room. She saw the water lily bloom. She saw the helmet and the plume. She looked down to Camelot. Out flew the web and floated wide. The mirror cracked from side to side. The curse has come upon me, cried the Lady of Shalott. So knowing that she has broken her curse by looking to see Lancelot as he was going by, she took that moment, she took that risk, knowing full well that something bad would happen to her. Even if she didn't have all of the details, she knew that there was a curse, and she knew something bad would happen to her, so she does it anyway. And so the last part 4, we see her descending from her tower. She goes to find a boat. She gets into the boat. She paints her name on the front of it as though it's kind of a floating coffin, and she wants her name on the boat to be her epitaph, like you would have on a tombstone. And before she even gets across the river, she sings her last song, her death song, and her features change, her eyes darken, her blood freezes, and before the boat reaches the other side, she is dead. And this is where there are some pretty major changes between the first and second versions. So the final lines of the second version read as follows. Out upon the wharfs they came, knight and burgher, lord and dame, and round the prow they read her name, the Lady of Shalott. Who is this, and what is here? And in the lighted palace near died the sound of royal cheer, and they crossed themselves for fear, all the knights at Camelot. But Lancelot mused a little space. He said she has a lovely face. God in his mercy lend her grace, the Lady of Shalott. That line about her having a pretty face is not in the first version. So Lancelot is kind of just a beautiful accident in the first version, where he's just traveling by, and he doesn't know who the Lady of Shalott is. Nobody knows her. Nobody has seen her. The only people who are aware of her are the farmers who work early in the morning to late at night, and they hear her singing, and they call her the Fairy Lady of Shalott, because she's kind of this mystical, magical, mythical creature, because no one has laid eyes on her. And it's telling, and I feel like that's a bite at the Victorian idea of women and men from Tennyson, this last line about Lancelot, who could have any beautiful woman, and being a very beautiful man, seeing this corpse, this dead woman, and instead of thinking, oh, what tragedy is this? You know, this is someone's daughter. How could this have happened? What was her life like? What could she have maybe accomplished if her life had not ended so soon? He says, she has a lovely face. God in his mercy lend her grace, the Lady of Shalott. And it takes a lot of the independence away from the Lady of Shalott, because the final line in the first version says, they crossed themselves, their stars they blessed, knight, minstrel, abbot, squire, and guest. There lay a parchment on her breast that puzzled more than all the rest the well-fed wits of Camelot. The web was woven curiously, the charm is broken utterly. Draw near and fear not, this is I, the Lady of Shalott. So, at the end of the first version, the Lady of Shalott kind of has taken ownership of her life and saying, don't be afraid, this is who I am, see me, know me. I'm not going to stay, locked away in a tower. I'm not going to stay victim to a curse anymore. However, in his revamp, his reversion, his edit, Tennyson adds in this very negative perspective of Lancelot, who is often seen as a motif of wonderful manliness and often can be written in with this courtly love of the knight. He's seen as very shallow. He is seen as very cold and kind of coarse. To look at a dead body and say, oh, she's pretty. It's a little odd, don't you think? That's a bit strange. Because nobody knows who this woman is. Nobody knows where she came from. We don't even have the parchment. She didn't bring a parchment with her in the second version. It's just her name written on the ship, the little boat. But that could very easily be the name of the boat, as boats were often given names. So it kind of takes away even the name of the woman, even though Lancelot kind of gives it back to her in that final line, as every line ends with the Lady of Shalott. It, to me, took a lot of self-propelling womanly power away from the Lady of Shalott and made her more of a victim, in my opinion. And you might have a different opinion. I'm really curious to see what you guys thought about this text. There are so many videos and there are so many resources about this particular text that it can get kind of difficult to weed through everything. So I'm really curious about what you guys think about it, and I have tons, front and back, tons of notes about this text, which is why I'm looking down so much. I have so much that I want to talk about. So the Victorian view of women is that they belonged in the home, they were considered the angels of the home, women were expected to have an angelic and perfect air about them, and Tennyson can be saying that this is a criticism of that women should be allowed to do more than just domesticated things, just weaving or staying locked in a home while the world and life is going on outside, and they only can get snippets of what happens in the world through a mirror, this half-life, this distracted and this distanced life, because they are expected to do certain tasks over and over and over tirelessly without any kind of break, or they would get a curse. And the curse could very easily be society's expectations of women. So say a woman decided she wanted to leave the home and she wanted to work. There would be a lot of pushback in Victorian era society about that, because one, there wasn't really a need for that, because men could have a job and provide for a family, and women didn't really need to be educated, women didn't need to be skilled, higher class women didn't really need to do anything except be a good wife and mother. That was the expectation. And if they wandered away from that, the idea would be that women couldn't handle it because they were the weaker sex, they needed to be provided for, men needed to be there for women, and that if they were to be given too much independence or too much power, that they would be undone by it, they would fall apart. So that's a debatable idea. You could say, okay, perhaps Tennyson thinks that this Victorian view of women is wrong and inappropriate, but then you have to wonder, okay, well, he doesn't give her a victory. He has her turn away from her whole life, from what's expected of her, knowing full well there's going to be some kind of curse or some kind of negative pushback, and she dies. There's no saving grace, there's no cure, there's no gift from God for having the bravery to push through like perhaps a knight would get. And it makes it seem as though, well, maybe women should stay in the house, because if they go too far out of that realm, they'll die. I mean, that's debatable, and that's just something I bring up to be devil's advocate and say, what do you think about this? A lot of questions can be asked in terms of whose fault is this? Is it the Lady of Shalott's fault because she knew full well what would happen to a degree and chose to do it anyway? Is it somehow Lancelot's fault for being a temptation of the world and seductive, and he didn't actively try to persuade the Lady of Shalott, but just his ultimate manliness luring her away from her safety can kind of indicate that men had great power over women, and that if women didn't have strict control over their urges and strict control over their ideas, that they could be undone by men. It's a thought. If you want to think about it from a spiritual view, considering that religion was really big, particularly in the Victorian era, because you wanted to have this idea of being chaste and being the angel of the house. So the tower would be the Lady of Shalott's safe space. In that area, she's free from sin, she is the angel of the house, she's protected, she's chaste, or at least she's virtuous in the way that she needs to be if she's not a mother. When she sees Lancelot, there's a physical and a literal descent from the tower, but it could also represent the fall of man. So going back all the way to the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve bites the apple. She is seduced by the devil, and you could maybe make the argument that Lancelot is a representation of the devil, who was this beautiful angel who was cast down, and then he became very deceptive. He would still appear appealing, and he offered these sweet ideas of what could be if the woman left her safe space. If you eat from this apple, you will have knowledge of good and evil. If you look out of your window, you will have the benefit of experiencing life in its entirety. So that's kind of the parallel there. Then the Lady of Shalott turns into an Eve character who brings on her own demise by biting the apple, by looking at Lancelot, by leaving the safe high up space and coming down to the lowly, carnal world where desire and following those desires, the things that you want, and trying to have everything when you could have had a safe area, but you just can't involve yourself in everything. So perhaps the tower is not a prison so much as an Eden, is a way of looking at it. It just depends on your interpretation of whether or not you think the blame lays with the Lady of Shalott. It could be that Lancelot was a seductive serpent type character with his coal black curls and the burnished hooves of his warhorse. If you want to look at it perhaps as a feminist view, which is how I wanted to read it originally when I read the first version, because remember, the Lady of Shalott had a lot more agency in the first version. It's the idea that the weaving being a domestic task that women were expected to do, and you give the woman the ability to stop doing that thing, and in the time that she has, she still doesn't have a lot of time. She knows what's coming, but it's like she's preparing for it more. We see more of what the Lady of Shalott does, and she has a parchment. She has the name on the boat. She wants people to know who she is, and she seems to have accomplished that goal. And maybe it was because of Tennyson's ideas of maybe women having more agency, could be why that first publication was not well received. It's possible. So maybe he changed it to make it more palatable, but more tongue-in-cheek and more of a criticism of what Victorians were expected, where he's saying, hey, if you keep women in this small space for too long in terms of society, eventually they're going to break away and pursue their own thoughts and ideas, and it could be our undoing as a society. So that could be a possibility where he's saying, like, eventually this box of expecting women to be perfect all the time and very strictly maintained and controlled isn't going to work anymore, and we might want to think about where that's going to lead us as a society and what that's going to mean for us as a society. So yeah, I think it was a really awesome read. This was probably one that I had the most fun with. I liked that it was in a magical fairy tale world, and I always like to try to find pieces with strong female characters, and I do still firmly believe that the argument can be made that the Lady of Shalott has some agency in what she's doing. I just think that the argument is maybe easier to make with the first version than the second version, and that was probably done intentionally and what have you. But I'm super curious to see what you guys thought about this one. Are you going to be doing the quote analysis, or are you going to be doing the chapter by chapter summaries? If I were going to do that one, I would break the parts up into the chapters, so parts 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you're going to do the quotes, remember, you got to have 20 quotes where you tell why they're important. You're not just summarizing what the quote says. You're talking about why it's important and how it feeds into the rest of the text. So thank you guys so much for showing up, and I'll see you on the next one.